When that creature came back from the cave, it then collected my father, and my father and that creature, they went inside that cave. My father just left my little brother standing there. After that, my father then went out of the cave, and he then collected my little brother. They then returned back home. So this is the kind of an environment that I grew up in. A lot of juju and a lot of charms. Then after the death of our father, we had nothing, because my father had sold off most of his land by the time that he got sick. He left no inheritance for us, and after that I then decided to go to the city. Whilst I was in the city, life was really hard, and at that time I was now a married man, and I had a child with a woman that I had married. And as I was going around looking for any work employment opportunity, I then approached this funeral parlor. Then the boss of that funeral parlor told me that they were looking for someone. That is how I started working in the mortuary. As I was working in that mortuary, I then collected my wife, whom I had left at the village, and I started staying with her in the capital city of our country. Whilst I was working at that mortuary, one day, that was when my boss called me, and he told me that there was something very important that he wanted to tell me. He told me that if I'll be able to do this kind of a job for him, then I was going to have a lot of money, so much money that I could actually stop working for him. I was really excited knowing the situation that I had grown up in and the kind of a life that I was now living now that I was a married man. So when my boss presented this opportunity to me, I was so happy, and I gladly accepted without ever knowing what kind of an opportunity it was. My boss then told me to return back home, so I went back home. And the next day, I was not supposed to go to work, but late in the evening, when I was sleeping, me and my family, I then received a phone call from my boss, who then told me that I was supposed to get out of the house. When I went out of the house, I waited for a little bit, and I saw a very beautiful car. At first, I thought that maybe it was a car that belonged to my boss, but upon looking closely at that very nice big car, I saw that my boss didn't have a car that was as expensive as the car that was standing in front of me. Then the man who was driving that car told me to get into the car. So I jumped into the passenger seat that is next to the driver's seat. Then he looked at me and he was really angry, and he told me that I had to go and sit at the back seat. So I got off from the passenger seat and I went to the back seat. Then he told me that he wanted to give me a very small job, in which I accepted. Me and that man, we drove off going to a place where a lot of people that are rich stay. Then when we had arrived into that suburb, I saw that this man's house, it was quite a beautiful house. But once we had entered into the compound of that man's beautiful house, I then saw that the yard was not well taken care of, as if there was no one who was working there. This man's compound was more like a bush. We then went inside. When we went inside, that man then took me to this other room. Then he started to give me instructions, and he told me all of the things, the properties that I was supposed to remove from that room that he had showed me. So I removed the furniture that was inside that room until it was empty. When we had finished, he told me that I was supposed to go to bed, and he gave me the keys and he showed me the room in which I was supposed to sleep in. The very next morning, he told me that we had to go and buy a bed. So we went and we bought a bed. You know, those very big beds, the queen-sized beds. We bought the most expensive, the biggest of them all. Then we returned back home to that man's house. But to my surprise, when we returned back to that man's house, I saw that the room in which I had cleaned the previous night I had seen that the walls to that room were all painted white, but when we returned back to that man's house, I saw that there was a brand new red carpet that had been installed onto the floor. Then the walls, they had been painted red, but it seemed as if the people who had painted the walls, they had done a rush job. It was not properly painted, but they had painted the walls all around with a red color. Everything in that room was now red. Then that man told me that we were supposed to return back to the mortuary so that we can finish off the job that he wanted me to do. This mortuary, my brother, that I was working for, this mortuary, it was more like a fly-by-night mortuary. I don't think that this mortuary was even registered in the system because there were so many certificates of competency that were missing. I don't think that this mortuary was even allowed to operate. And as for the health standards, no one even bothered to care about the health standards, because sometimes our boss, whenever we would tell him that we do not have the proper chemicals when we will be cleaning the corpses, then my boss, what he would do is that he would just rush out of this office. Then he would go and buy this degreasing liquid soap that is used at the car washes. Sometimes even the mechanics, they use that kind of a degreasing liquid soap so as to clean the engines. That is what we used to do whenever we would have run out of the chemicals that we used when we would be washing the corpses. We would use the liquid soap that is used at the car washes to clean these dead bodies. Sometimes what would happen is that you would go to work, then the boss will tell you that you were supposed to switch off the fridges so as to save electricity. The fridges will only be switched on when we would see that now there is water that is coming from the fridges. Then we would switch on the freezers again. This mortuary, my brother, it was just a fly-by-night operating without papers at all. I worked at that mortuary for 2 good years until I was given the job by that man. Then I came to Europe with the money that I had been given by that man because it was quite a lot. So this man, when we returned back to the mortuary, what had happened is that his wife had died at this other local hospital. Then we went and we collected that woman's body and we took it back to our mortuary. So her body was staying at our mortuary whilst she was waiting to be buried. But what this man did is that he lied to his relatives and he lied to his wife's relatives. He told them that there was a delay because there were some papers that were needed from the hospital so that we can clear off this dead woman's body so that she can be buried. So him and my boss, they dragged this whole process for about a week. After that, that is when that man lied to his relatives and to his wife's relative. The mortuary had been cleared by the hospital to release the body, but there was no such a thing because when we went to collect this woman's body from the hospital, we had the papers, everything was in order. But that man made it to seem as if the papers had gone missing. What this man did, my brother, is that when we returned back to the mortuary where I was working, I then went and I spoke with my boss who was in his office. He then told me that I was supposed to do everything that man was going to ask me to do. So I returned back with that. So I went to where that man was sitting and I told him that we were supposed to go into that room where the freezers were, in which we used to keep the dead bodies. So when we went there, we then waited for my boss because after I had gotten out of his office, he was on the call. Because after I had spoken with him, he was on the call. So we waited for my boss. After my boss had finished speaking with whomever he was speaking with over the phone, he then came into that room in which the freezers were. Then we removed that man's wife from one of the freezers. Then I started to clean up and dress up that dead woman's body. So this man's car had seats that were in 3 rows. There were the front seats, and then there was the seats that were in the middle. Then there were the seats that were at the back. One could actually fold those seats so that there can be more space at the boot. This is what we did. Then my boss told me to get into the car. When I got into the car, they just left me in that car, and they went into my boss's office. And what they were doing there, I do not even know. In that moment, Brother Nashi, I was really scared, knowing that I was in the same car in which a dead woman was lying in the front seat. But I stayed there because I needed the money, knowing the situation which my wife and my kid was in. When that man returned, we then drove back to that man's house. And when we had arrived at that man's house, it was really difficult for us to get that dead woman's body out of the car. So we had to drag that dead woman's body from the boot, and we went and we placed it into that room in which the walls were painted red and there was a red carpet on the floor. So we just laid that dead woman's body on the bed, that very big queen-sized bed that we had bought in the afternoon. Then that man told me to go and sleep in that room. My brother, I was really scared throughout the night. I could not even sleep. I kept on thinking what that man was doing with his wife's dead body. And I kept on asking myself that right now there were people that were gathered for that woman's funeral, but they did not even know that her husband had stolen her dead body from the mortuary, whatever he was doing with his wife's dead body. After that, the man told me that we were supposed to return his dead wife's dead body back to the mortuary. So we struggled again as we dragged his dead wife's body back into the car. This time we just left it at the This time we only folded the back seat, then we placed his dead wife, then we covered her body with a lot of blankets and other refuse bags so that people could not even see. But this man's car, it had tinted windows, so you could not see what was inside. When we returned back to the mortuary, that man then told me to go and search in his car, for he had placed a white plastic bag, and he told me that there was money that I was going to find inside that white plastic bag. So I went into the vehicle, and he had told me that I was only supposed to open this money when I had returned back home. And this is what I did. When I returned back home, I counted the money, and it was a lot of money, my brother, quite a lot. After that, that is when I made some plans so that me, my wife, and my kid, we can be smuggled into Italy. We stayed for a little while in Italy. After that, we then went to France. From France, that is when we migrated and we came here to Germany, where we are permanently staying here in Germany. Ever since we came here to Europe, we have never returned back home in Ghana. This is my own confession. There are many days when I think about this story that happened to me. I keep on telling myself that I am not different from a man who killed a lot of people because of all the things that I did. I feel so ashamed that the love of money made me to do all of these evil things that I did. Dear listeners, right there was a message that I received from one of our dear brother who is saying that he is currently staying with his family there in Germany. He did all of these things for the love of money. Yo,